Today we're going to be in the book of Job. And this is odd for me, okay? It's not that I don't preach from Job. It is like in the last year, I have been through the book of Job 4 times now. Last year, as a matter of fact, I would say probably the book of Job may have been the instigator to us reading the Bible through, okay? So I read through Job and I journaled through Job. And sometime during that time, I felt like, hey, it would be great if we all read through the Bible together and journaled together. And so that kind of started that conversation. So I read through Job and I journaled through Job last year. And then as I prepared for this year, so I'm reading twice. So I'm reading the daily readings, but I'm also in June at this point, okay? So I'm reading the June readings so I make sure that everybody's got information for podcasts and the sermons and what we're going to do on Wednesday nights and those kind of things. So I read through it to get prepared for this year. And then I read through it again to prepare for podcast. And now I have read through it yesterday being the last day in Job. I read through it again 4 times. And I'll be honest with you. When we were recording the podcast for Job, I understood why people used the terminology, the patience of Job, because it seemed like it was eternal. There were about 2 weeks that every day we had to talk about Job, and you have to know me. You have to know my personality, because I don't deal well with chronic complaining. I don't. I'm a firm believer anybody can complain. I like people who can find solutions. And so when people come to me with solutions, like I'm really thrilled. When people come to complain, I struggle with that. And when they're a chronic complainer, I really struggle with that. And as I read through Job, I was like, oh my gosh, would these men shut up? Right? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. I'm just going to be honest with you, okay? At least Miss Katie's with me. And so I thought about it, and in one of the podcasts, it may have been yesterday or the day before, Alyssa was doing some of those podcasts, and she said she didn't take it as complaining. She reminded me that he had been through a lot of trauma. And one of the things that I know is, and we've had that conversation outside of that podcast, is my personality is such that bad things come, let's suck it up and move on. You know, because I've told people before, because people have asked, well, what would you do if you were Job? If I lost everything I had, all right, if my house burned down, if everything I had was gone, I would lose sleep maybe one night, possibly 2. And then by the 3rd day, we're getting up and we're going to do something about it. Like, we're going to make something happen. We're going to rebuild the house. We're going to get a new job. We're going to start doing something. And that's just my personality, but everybody's not made up that way. And they had 7 days, whether you know this or not, like I don't know if you caught this, there are 7 days that nobody speaks. His 3 friends come, they sit in a circle, and nobody says anything. Is anybody else with me? Like, could you do that 7 days, just look at the same 3 people? I can't do it. And so some books of the Bible I read and I go, man, this is really hard for me to relate to this guy and these people and what's going on. So Job is one of the books of wisdom. Proverbs has a lot of short sayings in it. So Proverbs will be a verse or 2 verses. Sometimes it'll be 3 verses that tell you something you should do. If you do this, it'll change your life. If you act like this, it'll improve your life. That's a wisdom book. That's what Proverbs does. Job is also a wisdom book, but it has this lengthy analysis of a relationship between suffering and divine justice. That's the tension that is there. Why do good people suffer? Why are bad things happening to good people? Job has lived a life of righteousness, and why is this taking place in his life? And so this book, truly though, outside of what my personality takes sometimes as whining and complaining, there are some things in this book that fascinate me. That we can't talk about today, okay? So I want to talk just briefly as I introduce this about some things in this book that fascinate me. One of the things that fascinates me is in the beginning, and then one of his friends references this, what some people would call a secret counsel or a divine counsel. So there's a psalm that uses the terminology gods, okay? It's like there's this meeting of God, the supreme God, and whoever else. And so in the beginning of the book, if you recall in Job, it says Satan shows up at what appears to be a meeting, and God asks him, where have you been? It's not like God didn't know what he had been doing, because God is all-knowing, okay? God doesn't need the advice from whoever else happens to be there, but it's like, okay, you've been missing meetings. Where have you been? And Satan says, well, I've been roaming the earth to and fro. Later, one of Job's friends is going to ask him, do you know what takes place in the secret counsel of God? So when there's this conversation going on, do you know what takes place? There are other places that it talks about a divine counsel or a secret counsel. And it is in this meeting between God and Satan that Satan says, you know, I've been looking for somebody, and God says, hey, have you considered my friend or my servant Job, he says. And so I've spent, I don't know, for the last 6 months, this has piqued my interest, and it's a sermon that I can't talk about today. But the whole concept of God having conversations with Satan, with anyone else that might be present, and what those conversations might look like. The second thing that intrigues me about the book of Job, and I was sharing this with staff recently, is their lack of reference to Satan or the devil or an enemy. In our context, almost always when somebody is suffering, we will frame it in terms of the devil is attacking me, or Satan is at work. And when bad things happen in our life, we automatically attribute it to him, and we give him a lot of the credit. When you read through the book of Job, Job never finds out it's Satan. God never reveals that to him. God never says, I let this happen to you because you were a good person and I turned Satan loose on you. When God finally speaks, he never reveals that to Job. He never knows the cause of his suffering. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that they attribute everything to God. So when you're blessed, it's God. When you're suffering, it must be because you did something wrong, and God is offering some discipline or some punishment. All of it comes from God. The good comes from God, and the discipline or the punishment, that's how they would refer to it, comes from God. And I would say the thing that intrigued me about that is at least their acknowledgement that in all things, God is in control. It doesn't really matter if it's good things or bad things. Ultimately, God is in control. The third thing that sticks out to me are the strange creatures. Now, so y'all going to learn some things about me today, if you don't know. I'm not a sci-fi guy. Okay, so you won't see me if you get in my car, I'm not listening. I will listen to fiction books when Barbara and I are in there. You know, it's mostly spy books or some crazy, FBI, thriller we're listening to. But for the most part, I don't read fiction. I read nonfiction. I listen to nonfiction. That's what I'm consumed with. And so, like, I don't know all the Marvel characters. I don't know. I've never seen a Harry Potter movie. Nothing like that. So it's just not me. Star Wars, I have never watched an entire Star Wars movie ever in my life. And so those kind of things I don't relate to. And it's fine if you do. It's not like that's not what I'm saying. You shouldn't. It's just me, okay? But when I read Job and he start talking about some of these characters, like I think, man, this is from a science fiction movie, right? So some of these animals, like you don't know whether they're land animals or they're sea animals. You don't know where they come from or what they do. So there's these walking beasts that are, dinosaur-like that they call behemoth. There's these sea creatures called Leviathan, and sometimes he looks like he belongs in the sea. Sometimes he looks like he belongs on the land. And these things that they describe. And the interesting thing is whether we should take them as literal beings or if they're figurative, because this is a poetic book. Are they talking about something that represents something else? And so there's this debate about how you should view these animals and whether it was, whether we actually had these creatures living on the earth. And so that is something that intrigues me about this book. The other thing that intrigues me about this book, and the last thing before we're going to talk about the text, is the struggle of relationships. These are Job's friends, right? These aren't strangers. These aren't people on the sidelines that he has no concept of who they are and don't know the life that he has lived. They show up on the scene. They're silent for 7 days, which I think would have been cultural. There's this morning. He's lost his children. He's lost his stuff. The only thing he didn't lose was his wife. She's still present, and through all of that, and they come and they sit with him for 7 days, and then the accusations start. They call him a windbag, right? They tell him he's silly, he's braggadocious, that he thinks too highly of himself. Surely you can't be living as good. Surely you've done some wrong to some people that you don't remember. Surely you've done this. And they take turns, and then Job tries to defend himself. No, I did live right. I did do what I needed to do. And they accuse him and they debate with him about his trouble. And I would tell you that I think a struggle for all of us is to sit around the table or in a situation where somebody is going through a difficult time and to drop our perspective and try to hear theirs. It's a very difficult thing to lay down our opinions and lay down our desires to hear them out about what's going on in their life, what we want to do. It's why I do premarital counseling, and that's pretty much it, because my tendency is when you tell me, okay, this is my problem, I'm going to tell you how to fix it, right? Anybody else curse with that disease? I do. That's just my nature, okay? You're going to tell me this, okay? You got a drug problem, okay, here's how we fix it. You got this problem, okay, here's how you fix it. And most of the time, what I find is that people who are in need, have trouble, don't want to fix it. They just want to tell you, right? Most of the time, not always, most of the time, statistically, I mean, they'll tell you the same thing, that most of the time people don't want to fix it. And so there's this challenge in relationships where we don't appreciate the challenges of trouble, or we have differing perspectives when we arrive at the table. And so we're sharing, this is what I think you ought to do, instead of trying to listen to what's going on. This is a relatively short period of time that happens in Job's life. There's no way to pin it exactly down. He lost everything in a quick period of time. And the grief was, in this conversation, maybe 14, 21 days of talking, it seems to be, max. And then God shows up, and then things seem to get better. I will often hear people talk about the book of Job, and they'll say, I want to encourage you, be like Job. You just got to endure. As a matter of fact, the New Testament would talk about the endurance of Job. But I'll be honest, when I read the book of Job, I don't get a lot of encouragement. I get a little bit of encouragement at the beginning, okay, because he lived this righteous life, and God saw him, recognized he was righteous, and then his life goes to pot. It's just terrible. And then the last few verses it says, and then Job came back. That's a great, like, we like those stories. But the pieces in between, what he lost, all that he lost, his friends and what they're ridiculing him for, and how he lived. There's like 5 verses. There's just over 1,000 verses in the book of Job. There's just over 18,000 words. And the majority of them, when I read them, I don't get excited. I don't go, man, whew, I feel better. Right? It's just one of those books that we struggle with. So this is, as I told you, my 4th time through the book of Job in the last 12 months. And it is at this point that God finally speaks that we're going to talk about today. I asked the question on one of the podcasts, if God had spoken at the beginning, we could have eliminated 38 chapters. Right? If God had just said, this is what's going on, and this is why it's going on, it would have settled everything, and we wouldn't have had to read all of these griping old men sitting around the wood stove, right? Complaining to one another. I don't know that that's how it played out. That's how I pictured it in my mind, okay? And they're sitting there complaining, and the thing, listen, the reason why it would have solved it all is because the one question we want to know is why. If you're going through something, if you're struggling, if you're suffering, you want to know why. If something's not going right, if something's not working the way it ought to, you want to know why. Why is it not working? Simon Sinek has a book. It says exactly that. It says start with why. If you know why, everything else can be settled from there. And we read the book of Job and we know why. Okay? We know why because we're told in the first few verses. The thing is, Job is never told why. Job never gets explained why something is going on. This is the question I get most from people in some form. Why is this happening to them? Why do people have to die young? Why does divorce have to happen? Why are people suffering? Why are people in other parts of the world poor? Why? They want to know why. Why is this happening to me? Why did God allow it? What did I do to deserve this? Why them? Why me? Why my family? And we want answers that are not always there. And our desire, listen, because we're all guilty of this, our desire to give people answers can put us in trouble. We've seen this play out over the last 2 years, and you can take this ever how you want to, but the people's need to get an answer and people's need to give an answer has caused answers to be given that weren't sustainable or had any sustainability to them. And because people want to know why. Well, why do I have to do this? Or this is why you should do something. We want to always give the answer for why. Some of us think that we'll feel better if we know what the answer is. But I'm of the opinion that sometimes it is the process that we have to go through, that God wants us to walk through so that we can learn more about Him. I can tell you from experience that getting the answer does not always solve the problem. I don't know that it would have changed the dynamics of Job's life had he found out exactly why he was suffering. In the plan of God, we see this really small piece. Right? Think about how many thousands, depending on where you come from, thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions, whatever, side you fall on, people have been alive. And let's put your 70, 80, 90, or 100 in that. Among 7 billion, it's really just this small piece of what's taking place. And I'm not trying to make us feel insignificant. I'm just trying to help us understand that in the plan of God, like the things I see and the things that happen to me and what goes on in my life is just a small, small piece of the puzzle. And Job and his friends have offered all of these explanations to what's going on and why it's happening and why it took place. And then God finally speaks. God speaking is not always the answer that we expect. God never reveals why Job suffers. He just reveals to Job that that he is God and he's worthy to be worshiped. And no matter what happens in his life, it is important, it's paramount for us to turn to him. As a matter of fact, this morning in my journal, so yesterday in my journal, one of the things that I wrote, it wouldn't have been this morning because today was a different chapter. Yesterday in my journal, one of the things that I wrote is, God, help me to look to you and depend on you no matter what happens around me. No matter what is happening in my life, you are still God and you're still worthy to be praised. So let's look at this. Let's look at a few things in this passage here. First of all, there is such thing as a dumb question. This is going to be offensive to some people, I know, and I'm sorry. Not really, but we say things like, there's no such thing as a dumb question. Yes, there are some dumb questions. Okay? You may never heard any, but I'm going to give you one, okay? When I was young, I was traveling and singing. When I say young, I mean I was 16 maybe at the time. We sang at this little church over in Chakawinity. Y'all know where Chakawinity is? It's just the other side of Washington. Little bitty church off a back road. I don't know, maybe 20 people in the room. The pastor got up before we got up to sing, and he asked, did anyone have any prayer requests? That was kind of the tradition that I grew up in. People gave prayer requests every service, and you prayed for whatever the requests were. And this lady said, I want you to pray for Luke. He's been shot. I was like, oh, that's terrible. That's exactly what I thought. That's terrible. The pastor thought the exact same thing. He said, that's terrible. He said, is he related to you? She said, no, it's Luke on General Hospital. That, my friend, is a dumb question, okay? I laughed. I laughed out loud. The pastor tried to keep his composure. I give him credit for that. But sometimes we say things that they just really are missing the entire point. And that's kind of what God says to him. When God finally speaks, he speaks only to Job. He later speaks to his three friends, and he tells his three friends that they were wrong. Okay? He tells Job's three friends, Job did live right, and what he said was true. And if you want to be right for your false accusations, go back to him, make a sacrifice, and your sins will be forgiven. That's what Job tells us. That's what God tells his three friends. But when he speaks to Job, he says this. It says, then the Lord answered Job from a whirlwind. Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? When you're suffering and you're going through a difficult time and you want God to speak, this is not what you want him to say to you. Okay? You do not want him to show up and say, who's talking all this ignorance, right? He says, brace yourself like a man because I have some questions for you and you must answer them. God shows up. He shows up in a big way, this strong wind, the beauty of this, okay, the beauty of the strong wind is I got to believe that when the wind came, Job had to question what's going to happen now because it was a wind that blew the house down and killed his children. What trouble is coming to me now? And then God speaks out of it. And God can be in the middle of the very thing that you view as bad. In the very thing that Job had experienced pain from, God shows up to speak to him. And he says, brace yourself because you're going to have to answer to me. Ultimately, God's the person that we have to answer to, and we have to know how we're going to respond. And responding to God can be a challenge. He says, I have some questions that you must answer. First of all, there are some things you did not do. We take credit for things that we should not take credit for sometimes. There's a small book somewhere, there's a saying, and I've used it before. I've never read the book. I've just seen the quote that if you see a turtle on a fence post, he didn't get there by himself. And we often find ourselves the turtle on a fence post, and we take credit for stuff that we had nothing to do with. The verses go on, it says this. It says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line, what supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone as the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Listen, y'all, when you read Genesis, one of the beauties of this chronological Bible, coming to Job so quickly, is you read the creation story and then you get this. Creation just says God made, God spoke, and it happened. But here God speaking gives a whole different perspective. It says the angels and the stars are singing while all this is going on. It says, who kept the sea inside its boundaries as it burst from the womb? And as I clothed it with clouds and wrapped it in thick darkness, for I locked it behind barred gates, limiting its shores. I said, this far and no further will you come. Here your proud waves must stop. He says, where were you when all this happened? I'm the one that laid the foundations. I'm the one that supports its foundation. I'm the one that puts the cornerstone in place. I was there when the stars were singing. I was there when the angels were singing. Who contained the sea and wrapped it in its darkness? If you go back to Genesis chapter 1, it says, then God said, let there be space between the waters to separate the waters of the heavens from the waters of the earth. And that is what happened. God made this space separate the waters of the earth from the waters of the heavens. God called the space sky, and evening passed and morning came, marking the second day. Then God said, let the waters beneath the sky flow together in one place, so dry ground, land, and water, so dry ground may appear. And that is what happened. God called the dry ground land and the water seas, and God saw that it was good. Here in a poetic form, God speaks to Job and says, where were you at when all this was taking place? The thing that we have to understand in the concept and the work of God is that we are stewards, not creators. We talk a lot about creativity and being creative, but it still comes from God. What we're doing is stewarding the gifts that He has already given to us. God has given us this world. What are we going to do with it? Now, here's the second thing. There are some things you cannot do. I often hear people say, you can do anything you set your mind to. I'm not sure about that. Y'all with me? When I was younger, I wanted to be an NBA basketball player. I had two problems. The first was I grew up in a holiness church and they wouldn't let me wear shorts. That was problem number one that was hindering my basketball career. The second problem was I was a slow white dude. That was the second problem. I could shoot the ball pretty good, and I played basketball, but I had some limiting factors. And I don't really care how much I set my mind to it. There were some limitations that I had. I can't think myself taller. I can't think myself jumping higher. I can't even think myself faster. Now, I can move those things incrementally, but there are some things that I am just not capable of doing. And I know it's meant to be encouragement, but sometimes it's over-exaggerated. When we say you can do anything you set your mind to, it's meant to be encouragement. But in reality, there are some things you just cannot do. And God calls him out on this. He says, have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Have you made daylight spread to the ends of the earth to bring an end to night's wickedness? As the light approaches, the earth takes shape like clay pressed beneath a seal. Y'all, this verse this week, like it stuck out to me. It says the shape of the earth. All right, so that I don't need to go down this rabbit trail, but it says the shape of the earth as the sun rises, you can see. The most beautiful place to see this is in an airplane. When you're in darkness and light first begins to appear and you can see the curvature of the earth. That's God's talking about this long before there were ever telescopes, long before there were ever airplanes, long before there were ever spaceships and people could look down and see anything. God's saying, he says, as the light approaches, the earth begins to take shape. You can start to see things that take place. He says it's robed in brilliant colors. The light disturbs the wicked and stops the arm that is raised in violence. It says, have you explored the springs from which the seas come? Have you explored their depths? Tell me about it, if you know. If you've done these things, tell me about it. My favorite part of this was the part where how light comes and you begin to see the shape. But he says, light disturbs the wicked. The reason Jesus told us that we need to be salt and light is salt preserves. Salt makes things taste better, but light dispels darkness. The smallest of light can dispel darkness. You can walk in a large room with a candle and you can, in darkness, it seems like it starts to be pushed back. He called us to be light in the darkness, and light disturbs wickedness. If you want to know, listen, if you want to know what to do about wickedness in the world today, be a light. Don't hide your light under a bushel. Don't be ashamed of your faith in Jesus Christ. Be a light. I'm not telling you that you got to go on a street corner and stand on a basket and speaking to a bullhorn. But I can tell you this, you can be a light in the world and the place where you live, because light is what pushes back darkness. 1 John chapter 1 says this. It says, this is the message we heard from Jesus and now declare to you, God is light and there is no darkness in him at all. So we are lying if we say we have fellowship with God, but go on living in spiritual darkness. We are not practicing the truth. But if we are living in the light as God is in the light, then we have fellowship with each other, and the blood of the Son of Jesus, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. As a matter of fact, 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9 says, but you are not like that, for you are a chosen people. You are a royal priest, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness into his marvelous light. Last thing. There are questions you cannot answer. This is a tough one for me, because I know there are some things I didn't do. There are some things I cannot do. But man, I sure want to know the answer to just about everything. Why does it have to sleet and snow on Sunday? Like, I want to answer that. Yep. Right? Like, God, like this is your day. Come on. What's this about? And whether y'all have seen it or not, it's supposed to snow next Friday and Saturday, just in time for Sunday. And if it snows, listen, y'all got to know me. If it's going to snow 3 feet, and let's have a real excuse. Come on, don't. Anyway, that's different. Anyway, but there are some things I can't answer. I want to answer questions. I want to be able to say this is the reason why. And there are some things I just do not know. The beauty of Job 38 and 39 and 40 as it closes out and God begins to speak is that it reminds us that there is just some things that we cannot answer. As a matter of fact, let's read the passage first. He says, do you know where the gates of death are located? Have you seen the gates of utter gloom? Do you realize the extent of the earth? Where does light come from and where does darkness go? Can you take each to its home? Do you know how you get there? But of course you know all this. I love God's sarcasm. It's so beautiful to me because I appreciate it because some of that personality is in me. Okay? Right? That this sarcastic, of course you know. You were born then. He says, do you know how to get there? But of course you know all this, for you were born before it was all created. So you are very experienced. He says, have you visited the storehouses of snow or seen the storehouses of hail? He says, I have reserved them as weapons for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war. Where's the path to the source of light? Where is the home of the east wind? Who created a channel for the torrents of rain? Who laid out the path for the lightning? Who makes the rain fall on barren land and a desert where no one lives? Who sends rain to satisfy the parched ground and make the tender grass spring up? Does the rain have a father who gives birth to the dew? Who is the mother of the ice? Who gives birth to the frost from heavens? For the water turns as ice, as hard as a rock, and the surface of the water freezes. We spend trillions of dollars. As a world, we have spent untold trillions of dollars trying to figure some of these things out. Where does lightning come from? What makes it hail? Where does rain come from? How did this happen? How did this all take place? And thousands of years ago, God's giving us pictures of light dispelling darkness and how they're separated. Listen, the greatest discoveries are still only educated speculation. Why? Because, listen, the best scientist makes a discovery, but you know what every discovery does? Creates 10 more questions for that scientist. He's like, yeah, I found this, but now I don't know these 10 things. Listen, if a scientist solved the problem, guess what he don't have? A job, right? So what he's got to do is say, okay, I solved this, but it created 10 more problems. And even the best discoveries in the world are still educated guesses. Here's why. Because we weren't there. We weren't there at creation. We don't know how it happened. We don't know how God did it. We didn't see it when it wasn't present. And we struggle. We want these answers, but we cannot get them. And in this passage, he talks about the storehouses of snow and the storehouses of hail that have been reserved for the judgment of God. I encourage you, like from now forward, read through your Bible, and every time you see hail, think back to this passage. Because when they're leaving Egypt, guess what they're going to get? They're going to get hail. When you get to the book of Haggai, Haggai 2 mentions punishment from hail. When you get to the book of Revelation, there are several mentions of hail that are associated with judgment. And when you read this in the book of Job, all of a sudden you begin to understand, okay, hail can be associated in Scripture with judgment. It's fascinating to me when I read all of these things. And we want to know, where does all of this come from? And our culture today is still searching for the answers to some of these questions. They don't have the answer. And what ultimately God is saying to Job, because if we're in Job's position, we want to know, why did this mess happen? Why did I suffer? Why did you kill everybody in my family? Why did you take all my stuff, all my sheep, all my cattle? Why did you kill it all? Why did you do it? And what we want when God finally shows up is for God to say, this is why it happened. I'm trying to make this take place. And sometimes God never answers our question. But it doesn't mean he's not God. What he's trying to remind Job of is, listen, I got this in control. And right now, in your little world, there are bad things happening, but there's a purpose to it, and I'm going to make it all work out in the end. What you need to do is trust and depend on me. Ultimately, in your life right now, some of you are going, man, I want to know, why did this happen? Why did this person suffer? Why are these people dying? Why is this taking place? How did I end up here? Why is this taking place? Sometimes you can't. You cannot answer that question. Sometimes God will show up in your life and never tell you why. Amen. Never tell you why. The point is, can I trust him even when I don't have the answer? I don't have the answer sometimes. I want it. It doesn't, listen, let me just stop right here because I want to say this. Having faith and trusting God should not make us ignorant where we don't want to seek wisdom and know what the answer is when we can know it. But there are some times we just cannot know. And we have to continue by faith.